So over the past month, one of the things that I have been doing alongside watching films or playing games or whatever is I've been watching Westworld, the HBO series. I've been wanting to talk about this for quite some time. I wanted to do individual season reviews at one point. I wanted to do season 1 in 2017 when that was done airing, then season 2 in 2018, and you get the pattern by now. But unfortunately, life kept getting in the way, and even though I have reviewed quite a bit of stuff since then, I wanted to take proper time out to talk about Westworld. And so I decided to finally review all 3 seasons for you guys. Unfortunately, it's all going to be in one big video, this one. However, I'm going to divide this video up into installments. Of course, there will be part of it which will talk about just season 1, season 2, and then of course season 3. And even though this show has been out for some time, I don't necessarily want to go into spoilers right now. The reason is because I know a lot of people still haven't seen the show, or are in the process of watching the show, or haven't necessarily seen season 3 yet. And so I'm actually, despite the fact that these seasons are a few years older now, I'm going to try and keep spoilers to a minimum, even though when I talk about later seasons, some stuff's going to come up. Season 1, it premiered in 2016 and essentially tells the story of a park which is being run by a man named Ford, played by Anthony Hopkins, and they're basically creating robots to inhabit this world. Guests come in and they meet the hosts, as they're called, and they interact with the worlds. The guests cannot die, the hosts definitely can, and then they keep coming back, and basically the whole story keeps getting reset over and over again. And eventually, some of the hosts start to become a little more self-aware, and they realize that they're in essentially kind of a simulation, and that they're essentially being controlled to live a certain way, and eventually that lie starts to unfurl around them. This is discovered at first by people who are working at the facility, certain scientists, and eventually, as the conspiracy grows throughout the season, you find out how much of a hold Ford really has on the place, and how much he's planning on doing next that could essentially destroy the park. Not just that, but also affect the real world that is surrounding us. First season was brilliant. The performances across the charts were phenomenal. You follow some hosts specifically as the main characters. Dolores, played by Evan Rachel Wood, is the one who carries it all through the 3 seasons that she's in, and she's phenomenal. This is outstanding work from her, and as the seasons progress, she just gets better and better. One of the best performances that I've seen in television in a while. Also, Thandie Newton, who plays Maeve, was fantastic. These are essentially the 2 main hosts of this show. They're the 2 main characters that you're following the arcs of, as well as Bernard, played by Jeffrey Wright, who is also magnificent. And essentially, the stories that are being told from them are quite phenomenal. As things unfurl and you start to understand more and more about these characters and some of their more mysterious sides of things, as well as the way the park runs, I found myself to be very invested in it. Now, it's also a show, like I said, that requires a lot of focus, and that's also one of the reasons it took me so long to get going. Because I wanted to take my time and actually watch this thing and give it the attention that it deserves. And the visual spectacle on display, along with the really wonderful storytelling, really brought that home for me. Which, by the way, this is a gorgeous season. Ramin Djawadi's score is phenomenal. The way the production is handled, the action sequences, really there was no stone unturned in season 1. As the hosts, like I said, become more self-aware, and then eventually Maeve finally finds out about the fact that they're actually just robots, she starts to create an uprising of sorts in the real world, using the help of these 2 doctors who work there. I found that to be extremely riveting too, and eventually as the season comes to a close, season 1, it's absolutely phenomenal. Eventually you find out that Bernard himself is a host, and this also creates the question of how many people at Westworld are actually human and how many of them are hosts. This is a question that's asked actually throughout all 3 seasons, because there are times where you'll meet a certain character and you'll think, oh, that's definitely a human being, and then they sort of pull the rug out from underneath you and be like, oh, actually, that's not quite true. And I found that to be an awesome aspect too. This is more in season 2, but it starts to come up already in the first season itself. As the season comes to a close, you eventually realize that Ford is trying to do something new, to tell a new story in the park and bring in something very new to it, which could be very controversial. The shareholders are not quite pleased with what he's doing, and so they're trying to overturn his control on things and eventually oust him as the park runner of sorts. Eventually, as he's bringing his new story to life, all the other hosts that I've mentioned so far, they've all pretty much gone self-aware at this point. Dolores has a newfound purpose, and she essentially assassinates Sir Anthony Hopkins, and that's how the season ends. I also forgot to mention that during this entire season, there is a man in black, played by Ed Harris, who seems to be going around searching for something. His storyline is also very interesting, and we talk more about that in season 2. But I really liked his arc, and eventually, as you figure out who he really is and what he has to do with this story, because like I said, I'm trying to keep some spoilers away from here, I found that to be really interesting as well, and those reveals were quite fascinating to me. I highly recommend checking Westworld Season 1 out, as and when you can get a chance. It's on HBO Max or whatever service around the world that runs HBO shows. I'm assuming you guys got it. Please definitely check it out if you haven't yet. And I'm gonna give Westworld Season 1 an A. Season 2 came out a couple of years later in 2018, and this was a very different season than the first one. A lot of expectations, I guess, were held as to what this season could possibly do, and essentially what we get is a very non-linear structure. We constantly keep going back and forth between events that have taken place in Season 1, before Season 1, during Season 2, after Season 2 in a couple of cases. And essentially, it's a puzzle. We're putting this entire thing together, and it keeps cutting back and forth between events that have taken place, events that are currently happening, and like I said, events that have happened much, much before even the first season. I found this to be an extremely fascinating season, and as sequel seasons go, it's one of my favorites because it takes on that story structure that was very puzzle-like. It was very fun putting it all together and essentially bringing all of the different arcs and certain scenes that may have gone nowhere in Season 1 eventually brought together. For example, at one point in time, towards the end of Season 1, Ashley, a security head of Westworld, he goes looking for Bernard's assistant, Elsie, and she's missing. She's gone missing, and she eventually shows up again in Season 2, but Season 1 ends and he gets captured and you basically have no idea what happens. And I kept thinking, wait, are they ever going to go back to that? And then in Season 2, you'll get a scene which is like the continuation of that point. So it's like, just so you know, this is where he's been. So when he shows up at the beginning of Season 2, I was like, wait, so how did he get out of that situation? And then eventually you get that answer. And I thought that was really, really cool. And eventually certain characters and certain arcs that were left sort of up in the air in Season 1, eventually those characters come back in Season 2, and you also get some completion for their storylines as well. I found it all to be really fascinating. At the same time, you've got Maeve, who has been causing this uproar, and of course Dolores has now joined in. And basically Westworld has been completely just is gone to ruins. The park itself is just being completely overrun by the hosts, and who are essentially trying to make a choice for themselves. And so a lot of human beings are dead. But at the same point in time, at the second half of Season 1, we also got introduced to Charlotte Hale, played by Tess Thompson, who is essentially bringing in the Delos Security, the company that essentially owns the park, and is bringing in all the enforcements possible to basically take out all of the hosts, and to also at the same time protect their IP and eventually create more as and when they need their IP to flourish again. And that because of that, there is also a lot of expendable human losses in the process, which is also not that great. Season 2 definitely blurs the line between who's the hero and who's the enemy, even though Season 1 already did that, but in Season 2 it's even more so. Because you're trying to figure out what side you want to take, even though both sides are making mistakes. And essentially, they're sort of negating one another. But at the same time, I found it, because of that, extremely riveting, and there was a lot of debate to be had over the events of Season 2. I also want to give a credit to people on social media that I know who actually didn't spoil the season for me. I'm trying to remember back to 2018 when this thing was going on, and I don't remember ever feeling like, oh, now I know what happens in season 2, so thanks. And I think the reason is because, as someone mentioned, it's because it's so much of a puzzle. So much of it is being put together in the mind of the viewer that it's hard to sort of give spoilers, because you might see something and you might not get an answer to it until like the very end of the season. For example, the man in black, whose name is William, by the way, and he's running Delos now after the original owner died, and then there was a whole subplot about him becoming a host and basically going crazy. He has a brother-in-law named Logan, played by Ben Barnes, and eventually you find out that there is something that he's been doing, even though he's been dead for a very, very long time. And he's kind of an asshole in season 1. You see him as one of the guests, and he's like, oh yeah, this is not a great guy. But eventually, Westworld season 1 also started playing with the fact that all of this that was happening around had been going on for many, many years. And so season 2 sort of brings that home and like, oh yeah, this has been going on for longer than you think. In fact, Dolores may seem like, this all happened days ago, but really, this has been building up over time. And like I said, you keep coming back to life. So you've lived like 100 lifetimes, 1,000 lifetimes by now, as well as Maeve, as well as all the other hosts that are part of this. And there's a lot of fascination to be found in those storylines. Visually, once again, this is absolutely spectacular, and it's wonderfully scored as well, and directed and written. Season 2 is also, however, the place where some criticism was given, because a lot of people were a little muddled by the way the storytelling structure was. I didn't really mind it that much because, like I said, I enjoyed the puzzle aspect of it. I liked sort of going back and forth and eventually putting the pieces together for myself. Granted, I don't speak for every audience member, but I really enjoyed that particular process of it. And also, the action is doubled up in this season, and it is really remarkable stuff. The production value has significantly increased in this season. Of course, we'll talk more about production and visuals in season 3 for sure. But I really love the job that they did with season 2, and there are aspects of it I actually liked more than season 1, which is crazy to say because season 1 was already a really good season. Season 2 topping some of that, it's kind of impossible. It's kind of amazing, actually, but it actually does. In some cases, though, I think season 1 is still a little bit better, however, and so I sort of end up at a tie between the two seasons. I love both of them quite immensely, and like I said, I'm still keeping plot details and threads pretty sparse because I don't want to give too much away just in case. But unfortunately, spoiler warning, I do have to talk about how this season ends because it's gonna basically make my conversation in season 3 matter. So season 2, you've got Delos' security basically trying to figure everything out, and Dolores is trying to basically shut down the entire system and restart the entire thing. Bernard eventually shoots her, but then eventually he recreates a new body with Charlotte Hale's body, and killing the real Hale, played by once again by Thompson. And so she becomes another version of Dolores, and Dolores makes multiple copies of herself and eventually moves into the real world. Bernard is also supposedly killed in all of this by Dolores, but eventually he comes back too, and he's also in the real world. And essentially, season 2 ends with the setup that we're now in the real world, where we're outside of the park now. Basically, it did in the second season what Jurassic Park series took 5 movies to finally end up doing in Fallen Kingdom. Anyway, I'm gonna give Westworld Season 2 an A. Which brings us to Season 3. Now, Season 3 is a divisive one, because for a lot of people, this was not a good season at all. In fact, I was heading into Season 3, and I've been talking about these 2 seasons on social media, by the way, the ones so far. And so far, words of encouragement, there was words of praise. Season 3, everybody I spoke to said, no, don't do it, it's bad, it's really bad, people forgot about it, nobody wants to talk about it, it's terrible. And I said, okay, you know what, open mind, I'll go in, I'll check it out, but, let's see what happens. Even the reviews were lower than the first 2 seasons, but they weren't anything to be concerned about necessarily. Definitely a fall, but I definitely wanted to give it the benefit of the doubt at first. And season 3 definitely was make it or break it. Some people will really like the directions that it takes, some people really won't. It essentially takes a concept from the first 2 seasons, which was that eventually the people who were running the place, the guests, their data was being copied and eventually they could also become hosts. this was a concept that was brought up. And essentially, season 3, we enter a man named Sirach, played by Vincent Castle, who has this thing called Robomb, which is essentially this big ball with red lines of data, and it's essentially something that can predict the future. It has predicted the course of humanity and how things are going to do, things are going to go based on probabilities and based on the data that they have right now. It has also decided when people are going to die, how they're going to die, the stuff that's going to lead to that, their life trajectories going forward, what happens in a few years, what happens a few years after that, and eventually it ends in their demise. Season 3 brings up that concept. It's a very interesting concept, and essentially it brings up the idea that now everybody around the world is in control of Robomb. Now, this is very interesting, and in some cases maybe a bit ludicrous, and I can understand why some people were probably turned off by that idea, but it had felt very much like an expansion of the idea that was brought up in the first 2 seasons. But essentially, it takes the idea that the hosts were being controlled this entire time. Then the hosts started to take control in season 2. But with season 3, essentially, it makes everybody a host. And so I can understand why that seems like a bit far-fetched. It's sort of like when people got to the end of, I know this is a funny example, but when people got to the end of John Wick Chapter 2 and they were like, oh, so half of New York is the assassin club thingy? Seriously? Similarly, that can be a turning off factor. I was, however, very invested in this season, and while it's not as good as the first 2 seasons, I will say that, I found myself to be invested in it, whereas the first 2 seasons really had the psychological character dramas down to a T, as well as your understanding how each host is now responding to the changes around them and essentially becoming more human as the events progressed, along with Dolores and all the other main hosts, and Dolores is, like I said, around the main world. This one's more of an action thriller, and essentially you start off, you have a new character named Caleb Nichols, played by Aaron Paul, who does these side jobs, he makes some money off of them, he essentially takes out some targets, and eventually he runs into Dolores, who gets injured because she's trying to infiltrate Delos and basically trying to understand what this Robomb thing is. And as the two of them start to work together, you start to learn more about Caleb and how he had a big role to play in all of this. Now, I'm not going to go into spoilers about this one because this is the season I know that a lot of people have yet to watch because, things have happened this past year, and so a lot of people haven't seen it yet. And for the most part, I really like the trajectories that it takes. However, parts of it did feel slightly retcon-like because there were moments in it I thought, how did this not get mentioned in the previous 2 seasons? Like, these are some major things that are being brought up. I thought they would have had a little more bearing on conversations that have happened before, unless I missed a detail. In which case, mea culpa. But I don't think I did. I watched those first 2 seasons quite intently. In fact, played back certain episodes because I wanted to make sure I got everything jotted down to a T. Unfortunately, I didn't come across those details, and so it definitely felt slightly like, we're sort of veering away from it. But it's also important to note that season 3 is a totally different show from the first 2. One, we were in a very futuristic, Blade Runner, cyberpunky space, and that is reflected not just in the visuals, but even the score, because the first 2 had a more orchestral score, but also some dramatic synth beats to it, here and there. Season 3 is entirely a synth score, and it's definitely got a lot of, Blade Runner and cyberpunk-like vibes to it. And the reason I say cyberpunk is because I've just been playing that game. And so while I was watching this season, I kept thinking, wow, I'm hearing the Cyberpunk 2077 score, and it's amazing. And then now I'm listening to this score for season 3 of Westworld, and there's a lot of the same, electronic stuff in here, which is kind of amazing. So eventually my head has now become an EDM space. But where seasons 1 and 2 held on to the characters as well as those ideas, and it held on to those concepts that it was constantly developing and making you ask questions about, season 3 feels surface level. It feels like it takes a step back in what really made those first 2 seasons more interesting. It also takes a more streamlined approach. Season 2, like I said, was like a puzzle, and some people were a little critical of that aspect in terms of putting it all together. And so season 3 is very much a chronological order-based series. You basically go from point A to point B by the end of it. And That's fine. That's all right with me. But I wish that it had nearly the level of depth that the first two seasons did. It definitely feels slight in terms of that narrative. And also a lot of characters and their motivations don't feel quite as well executed as I think the first two seasons were. And that sort of takes a back seat to the action sequences, which there are plenty of in this season. In fact, compared to the first two seasons, this one is basically action every like 15 minutes or so. There's a lot of explosions and a lot of, stunts and hand-to-hand combat that you witness in this season, and it's all very well executed, by the way, but it definitely, I feel like it just robs the story a little bit. That being said, season 3 was still very interesting, and that idea of this machine essentially being able to tell everybody's life stories in these devastating ways was very interesting to witness. And I still recommend checking it out, especially if you've seen the first two seasons. Just take a look at where it's going. I mean, it's definitely worth giving the benefit of the doubt to. Like I said, it's make it or break it. So really, you could go either way. Either you really like what they do, or you might not like what they do. Me personally, I thought it was pretty good, and I'm interested in seeing where they go forward. Season 4 has been renewed, and so for now, I'm gonna give Westworld Season 3 a B. Definitely a step down from the first two seasons, though, I will give it that. I know there's a lot I haven't mentioned in this review. I know that there's a lot I've skimmed through, and I completely understand that, but I don't want to give every plot detail away either. I want to keep some things savored for the viewers as and when they choose to see this show. Granted, it's not everything that I've kept hidden. I've given away some spoilers, but I still wanted to talk about this season, and I don't want to keep you guys sitting here for like an hour either. So I had to trim out certain details. But guys, thank you very much for watching. And if you enjoyed this review, please just subscribe. I'll be talking about more stuff very, very soon. As always, if you like this, please do subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the movies.